I think we could define lawfare as Ellen did. Another way I like to think of lawfare is by using Clausewitz's definition of warfare. Right? Lawfare comes from the idea of law and warfare. You may know the origins of the phrase is from a friend of mine, Charlie Dunlap, who was writing about, in fact, the ways after 9/11 terrorist groups used our own legal system to try to continue their war against the United States. Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And I think that's what we're living through now, that we're seeing the use of prosecution as just a continuation of politics by other means. And the point of my remarks is, unfortunately, I think you have to approach it in the way we think about warfare. And we have a side, I don't think it's, unfortunately, particularly Democratic or Republican, I think it's more progressives versus conservatives, but progressives who believe in bringing about a utopian world, who are willing to do anything to achieve that means, to cast aside institutions and cast aside norms, have broken an important tradition and norm in our country of not prosecuting past presidents, not prosecuting the leading opposition candidate for president. Right? And that, unfortunately, if we look at warfare, the only way to get someone who refuses to obey an important norm is that you have to retaliate. You have to retaliate against them exactly the same way until you restore some amount of deterrence. And so if we're not going to become a banana republic country where we continuously prosecute our predecessors in office, unfortunately, I'm afraid we're going to have to use banana republic means, which is, I think, unfortunately, people who have used this tool against people like John or President Trump have to be prosecuted too by Republican or conservative DAs in exactly the same way for exactly the same kinds of things until they stop. And we can restore the norm which existed for the first 230 years of our republic through times with politics which were just as heated as our own, or maybe even more so. But we never crossed this Rubicon of using prosecution to achieve our political ends. And during the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about any of the Trump trials and how what's going on in them. But the reason why I say what I do is because the charges in these cases were so flimsy. I'm willing to entertain if the special counsel here in Washington had charged Donald Trump with insurrection and sedition, which are crimes in the federal code, I might think differently about it. And if he could prove it. Instead, he went to a grand jury in Washington, D.C., of all places, and could only get them to indict President Trump for fraud of the kind that we usually charge hospital systems with or defense contractors for, right? Fraud where you steal money from the government. They charged him with obstruction on a charge that was just thrown out by the Supreme Court for being misused against anyone involved with January 6th, and for depriving everyone in the country simultaneously of their voting rights. I don't know if you felt that happen to you in November of 2020, but Donald Trump took away all your voting rights simultaneously by trying to get Mike Pence to reject electoral votes from certain states. To me, the fact that the charges were so weak and the facts so loosely connected to those charges, is what led me to think the prosecutions are partisan in nature. And that's why the natural response has to be to stop them. You have to bring prosecutions too. One other quick point about this is one other lesson we've learned about these prosecutions is we all expect, I think, as Americans, that the courts will do something about it. And I hope one lesson we've learned from the Trump trials is that the rule of law, if you want to say the rule of law is the requirement that the same cases are treated in the same way, it's not really up to the courts anymore. It's up to the administrative state and the executive branch. The government, the executive branch, and prosecutors have so much power to destroy someone's livelihood and their reputation before ever stepping foot in court. That they're really the ones who control whether we have the rule of law. If they prosecute someone like John Eastman, they could destroy his finances and his reputation before any judge ever sees him. The judges also say they're not going to review, under this doctrine of prosecutorial discretion, why prosecutors pick out someone or someone else for prosecution. So when Donald Trump is prosecuted for hoarding classified documents, courts will not say, oh, but why didn't the Justice Department charge Hillary Clinton for routing thousands of classified emails through her, right? I don't know. I would call it a non-secured home computing system, right? That's, unfortunately, the courts will not guarantee the rule of law by looking at the reasons why prosecutors choose cases. And so the only restraint on prosecutors, the only way to guarantee equal treatment, the rule of law, is by prosecutors limiting themselves. And how do you do that? You can only do it through elections, by electing people who will demand that the subordinates in the executive branch follow what you would think of would be basic principles, like equal treatment under the law, or the tactic I'm suggesting, unfortunately, which is now, if one side is in charge of the executive branch and they're not willing to follow these principles, then I think red state DAs should charge some leading Democratic politicians with fraud, right, with obstruction, right, with RICO charges, like the DA in, in Georgia, in Fulton County, has charged the Fulton County DA has actually charged a political campaign as being a racketeering, which is the phrase we use for organized crime enterprise. Well, unfortunately, I think the only way to deter that from continuing is for red state DA to charge some Democratic campaign with RICO. And that's let me close quickly in the interest of time. I'm afraid that's how I would think of lawfare. With lawfare, we tend to focus on the law. I'm calling for us to think about it also as a form of warfare. And so when you think about warfare, and probably the only way that you can encourage good behavior, a return to norms, is through deterrence. And the only way to restore deterrence now that one side has crossed this constitutional Rubicon is that, unfortunately, you have to be as tough on them as they have been on you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to the questions.